Coming up on Evoke LA.
What does the past sound like?
A lot of the history that gets told from our perspective, it is not necessarily from our point of view. And
we're undocumented in LA, and it's like, you can't say anything. Tell our story.
My dad was in Banda Blanca. I remember him texting this song to me and being like, I wrote all the arrangements, played keyboard and guitar, and I didn't use autotune. Cuando yo pienso en ti y recuerdo nuestro amor.
My mom is hardcore. She had to be.
She was like, I wanted you to be a news anchor.
We could make your dream come true. We actually tried to get your mom here today, but her rates are so high.
I am my mother's daughter. I'm only a woman if woman is a word.
Welcome to Evoke LA, a collaboration between Aloud, KPCC, and LAist and the Los Angeles Public Library. From the archive to the stage, this is Evoke LA.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Evoke LA. I'm Leslie Beristain Rojas, Immigrant Communities Correspondent for KPCC and LAist. I'm delighted to introduce the folks joining me for today's program. First of all, he's the professor and chair in cross-cultural communications at USC Annenberg and an award-winning cultural historian, critic, and curator with a focus on the intersection of arts, culture, and politics. He's a 2016 MacArthur Fellow and curator of this Evoke LA series. Welcome, Josh Kuhn.
Thank you so much. So good to see you.
Likewise. She's Associate Professor of Chicanx Latinx Transnational Studies at Pitzer College. Her work focuses on the intersection between labor, gender, ethnicity, race, and marginalized identities in workers' lives in Central America and in the U.S. Welcome, Suyapa Portillo Villeda.
Thank you. So glad to be here with all of you.
Thank you. And Empress of is the solo musical project of first-generation Honduran-American singer-songwriter Loralee Rodriguez. Growing up in Los Angeles, she began writing and performing songs at the age of 13 and knew right away it was going to be more than a hobby. She has released and self-produced 4 albums, collaborated with the likes of Khalid, Amber Mark, and Dev Hynes, and toured with Lizzo and Maggie Rogers, among others. Welcome, Loralee Rodriguez.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Very glad to have you here. Very glad to have you all here. So, Josh, what is Evoke LA?
Well, we've been trying with this series. What I really wanted to do was to continue work I've done in the past around the archival collections and special collections of the LA Public Libraries. And as a curator and cultural historian, my goal is always to not just document the past, but to think about how these archives can be animated and brought into new contemporary conversations, and how these past archives can actually create conversations that might otherwise be impossible. And so with Evoke LA, what we're doing is we're taking one piece of archival material, and each session I'm giving it to a musician with kind of the question is, what does the past sound like? And so even if it's not a piece of sheet music, we'll get to that in a later episode, but there will be pieces like photographs or restaurant menus or other kinds of ephemera and documents that hopefully musicians are going to live with those pieces, and as we're going to hear and see today, kind of bring them to life in new ways.
So let's start with the photograph. It is simple, it is beautiful, and to some of us it is very familiar. Josh, I'm going to let you describe it for us.
So this photograph, which I think we've all seen, I was trying to look through the special collections and the incredible photo collection of the LA Public Library to kind of look at their holdings around the history of Central America and Los Angeles. And I came across this photograph from 1986 that is simply titled Central Americans, West 7th Street. And the photographer is Stephen Gold. It was part of the Shades of LA project, incredible photography project that started in 1991 at the LA Public Library. And the kind of metadata for it only says this: a woman and her daughter walk along a block of West 7th Street. Small shops and businesses operate from old buildings which line the sidewalks. And so that was the prompt, was to kind of live with this photograph a bit and see what we can come up with together. This photograph, of course, comes from the special collections of the LA Public Library, and I need to give huge shout out to the incredible Ani Boyajian, who has just been instrumental in maintaining the photo collection at the LA Public Libraries, as well as many other special collections, and has been so helpful to me in doing the work that I'm trying to do with this series.
It's a great idea. It's a really great idea. So I want to go to the panelists. I want to go one by one because this photo connects to all of us. I'll tell you a little bit about myself before I move on to you. So roll back the clock about 10 years prior to that, and it would have probably been my mom going to the outlet store at the corner of 7th and Alvarado. We came from Cuba, and I grew up in LA. And now you are both Hondureñas, so I want to talk to you about your experience and what this photo, what it means to you, how you connect with it, what it evokes for you.
Yeah, well, it could have been my mother and I. We came in the early 80s, and we actually would go to El Piojito, which was on Wilshire and Alvarado. And it was sort of like a place where you can, buy anything you needed. You could put money down, and then once you paid it off, you take things home. So I thought of me and my mom taking the bus from Echo Park to, 7th and Alvarado, and going to any of those businesses to purchase food or, many of the items we ate, like pupusas or tamales, you could only get in MacArthur Park or buy from ladies who would sell in the park. It really brought me back. There's an image of me and my mom in 1984 during the Olympics, and we went down to MacArthur Park, and there was a photo booth, and so because it was the Olympics, you could choose from different frames, and so we have this, Olympics LA 1984 photo. This photo reminded me of that photo, right? We were alone. We were completely alone in the world. We crossed the border by ourselves. We didn't have any family here. So Pico Union and MacArthur Park was sort of like that place that could be home for us.
Lauralee, I want to hear your take on that photo.
Wow, what a beautiful anecdote, Suyapa. Thank you so much for that. I look at that photo and I see myself and my mom, but I also see, the work that my mom put into having the comforts that she has, that she doesn't take for granted. So maybe it might sound a little of a joke, but my mom does not walk very much in the streets. She's like, I worked hard for this car and I'm driving there. And I don't know, I look at the photo and I'm just like, I look at how hard my mom has worked to get where she is. But there are definitely lots of moments, especially in the history of Los Angeles, in growing up here and going to Curaçao and Segundas and just going to stores with my mom, and also just how much, immigrants come to LA and they find comfort in being in their community. And so my mom would go to these stores and just run into other Hondurans who are kind of going through the same process that she's going through. And I'm just kind of being a kid and the world is really big. So yeah, I definitely saw a lot of myself in that photo, but I saw more of kind of how hard my mom has worked. I don't know, all those images like that always just make me feel like my mom kind of came here to give me a bunch of opportunities.
Thank you both. Thank you both for those anecdotes. No, one of the things that I was just there, actually. I was just on that corner the other day working, and there's still a store there. There's still a little store, a little five and dime type of store, and it made me think of, knowing that we were going to have this conversation just made me think of Los Angeles and the way that there are so many different generations of us who have come through that community, through those streets, through that space, through everything. I was talking to my mom about it today, and she says, oh, that was where we bought our first clothing with our own money that wasn't donated. I was like, oh my God. So yeah, it's very meaningful for so many of us. So Josh, what made you want to choose that photo?
I think, I think the power of it as an image, it's so simple, as has already been said, but this image of these two people who we actually don't know if they were mother and daughter, but one assumes, in looking at the photograph, that there is a young woman and a young girl walking on a kind of amazingly empty street. I mean, it's kind of amazing that there's no other folks around them, surrounded by these storefronts, and it is this portrait of quote-unquote Central American Los Angeles, right? But that's also what attracted me to the photo, was the description of it and the title, which was not Honduran American mother and daughter, but just Central Americans. And this is not, I'm not trying to, go off on metadata and, be mean to people who, do metadata input. But it was striking to me that this framing of this as just this vague, big umbrella category, Central Americans. And we don't know the names of the woman. We don't know the name of the girl. And I think that said something to me about hopefully how far we've hopefully come since '86 in dealing with immigrant history in Los Angeles, of dealing with the history of communities of color in Los Angeles, that we've moved away, hopefully, from this monolithic approach of classification, that we don't care about people's names. We don't care about their stories. They're just Central Americans on West 7th. So I also thought, as powerful as the photograph was, that it also is a powerful opportunity to break that down a little bit and explode it actually from the inside, as we just heard with both of your stories, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. Thank you for that. Laura, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just want to add something to Josh's point that, a lot of the history that gets told from our perspective, it is kind of like vague and, I don't know, not necessarily from our point of view. And there's actually someone I love who is kind of undoing that in an untraditional way. You guys are probably familiar with Veteranas en Rucas. What started as an Instagram account, but now the artist is gonna continue to do bigger work. But I love that artist kind of retells these pictures and finds the names of these people, and it's like, this group and the cousins, they're at, this park for the car show. And I just love kind of taking back our stories and histories and kind of being able to tell it properly.
So because this photograph, of course, comes from the LA Public Library, I was actually curious about your library experiences growing up. Were you ever frequenting a library?
When you asked me to do this, I asked if we could do it at my library that I grew up at, which is gorgeous. It's the Altadena Public Library. It's just like a gorgeous mid-century building, and it still has all the furniture. And my dad would take me there once a week. And we would look through music books, we would look through, all kinds of stuff. And I think it's such a gorgeous, gorgeous library.
I think we need an Empress of takes over the Altadena Library.
I would give my left foot to play there. I would 100% do a private concert. I mean, not private, a small concert there. It's so stunning.
So in terms of our histories then, I guess the next question that I had is for Suyapa. So this is 1986. This photo was taken in 1986. I'd like to talk about the backdrop against which this happened, this particular migration to Los Angeles that has really changed Los Angeles in so many ways.
Yeah, 1986. I'm thinking about El Salvador here because the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Army was actually not winning, right? It wasn't winning. And in 1982, and actually when Reagan took office in the early 80s, the excessive amount of money in covert operations that went down to El Salvador to cripple the guerrilla was so intense, right? There were tortures, there were massacres, same in Guatemala. So this was a really hard period for Central Americans, and many were coming. And they were coming as undocumented immigrants, just like my mother and I came. And the reason they were coming as undocumented immigrants is because the Reagan administration was not granting asylum or refugee status, although you would think it's plain war and there was plenty of proof. If the Immigration Naturalization Office at the time would have granted status, that would implicate Reagan in these covert wars. So, we're talking Iran-Contra affair at the same time, right? And Honduras, since we're Honduran here, Honduras was actually sort of serving as the airport to this war, right? So there's Centro Regional del Norte and North Coast of Honduras that was actually where people were tortured. And this is a place that owned by the US military. Actually, the owner was a Puerto Rican military man. We still don't know who was tortured there and how. There's still a lot of silences. So while there are a lot of silences about our migration and who we were here, there's a lot of silences about, bringing people, perpetrators, military men, US covert actors, right? Cold Warists, Kissinger and many of the folks that served in the Reagan administration and the first Bush administration and the second Bush administration were implicated in Central America. So if you go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., you look up El Salvador and the boxes are empty because all those operators are still alive today. So it's really eerie, right, to see this still happening. And 1986 was also an interesting period because the amount of money going in to defeat the guerrillas, both in Guatemala and El Salvador, was so extreme. The CIA, there were about 52 CIA operatives in Guatemala. For a small country of about, 10, 12 million people, that's an excessive amount of US operatives and force, all covert, right? The only people talking about this were the churches, right? The Jesuits, the Methodists, those people that were allies, whose churches and parishes were in Pico Union. The Anglican Church was a food bank that we all went to. The Methodist Church near Koreatown, and of course Placito Olvera, Olvera Street. So these were like places where you couldn't speak the truth about what was going on. I want to come back to Honduras too, because the 1980s was a critical moment where the Reagan administration found allies among the military in Honduras. And that's a really sordid history for Central Americans to contend with now, right? When we think about Honduras of the present, so.
Yeah, and you both grew up with a lot of conversation about this. There was a lot of trauma. That was in the community too, growing up with this. Can any of you talk about that? Yeah.
I want to talk about this because we actually didn't talk about it. And this is something that, I teach in Central American Studies. I'm one of a few scholars who actually are in the process of building Central American Studies in the universities. And all of our students say this, but we also say this. We never talked about this. We blended in. I went to Logan Street Elementary School in Echo Park, and all of us Central Americans used to hang out in a corner, and we were, kids are cruel, right? So they would make fun of us because we didn't quite fit in, right, among the Chicanos. But we never talked about it. We never talked about the violence and the war. My brother was going to be killed in Honduras. He escaped barely. He was a student organizer at the National University. And when we left, you leave everything. You leave everything. And so I remember crossing Guatemala during the military period, and my mom used to say, you can't cry, you can't say anything. Then we're undocumented in LA, and it's like, you can't say anything, you can't tell our story. Your parents train you to not say anything, which is something that's interesting if you think about documented students, right? Like, they also don't share their stories, or we're told not to, right, for protection. So that's so interesting, because now we're in the generation of, your generation, right, who wants to tell the story. So we're really seeing a new future for Central Americans.
I was just going to say, it's really stunning to hear you frame it that way, because, if you just look at numbers and demographics, you talk about El Salvador, you talk about LA being, the largest Salvadoran city outside of that country, and yet for all of that size, and Guatemala too, for all of that size, there's an equal size of silence. That's fairly, I don't know if it's singular, but it's very different, let's say, than the history of Mexican Los Angeles, where there's a much longer history of public discourse, public speech, public visibility. So it's just really striking to hear you frame it that way.
Yeah, I feel like people, first we were undocumented. We also, all of the guerrilleros were exiled here, or student leaders were exiled here. So you could have been deported to death. There was no asylum. People understood that they had to kind of lay low, if you will. Where I think Central Americans shined were, for example, in Justice for Janitors campaign, right? Where they, organized. My mom was a member of Local 11 HRE. She actually was one of the members of the union who helped organize Maria Elena Durazo to be president, the first Latina president in the union. But that's where they shine, kind of like, how do we organize, In my previous career, I was a union organizer before going to grad school, and, we always wanted to have Central Americans in our organizing committee, because we knew they were bold, and we knew they were collective, and they thought collectively. we never really said it that way, but, whenever we got, a Salvadoran woman in our community, we're like, yes, we're going to build something here. And those were the people that brought, Justice for Janitors and HERE into prominence, I want to say, among recent Mexican immigrants, because we needed to collaborate, right? Actually, USC, my mom was a housekeeper at USC, and, there were so many actions that as a kid that we would go, so I grew up knowing USC really well because there were work stoppages and strikes, and, she couldn't leave me at home, so there I was, like this college campus. So a lot of us became politicized that way through the labor movement. And then Carecen, El Rescate, right? These organizations that gave us resources, secondhand clothing, food, a turkey for Christmas. You know what I mean? Those are the places where you would go to talk to lawyers and basically hear the bad news. Your case is not going to go anywhere. You have to try something else, So.
Laura Lee, yeah, I want to hear more about, your own memories of this, your conversations with your mom, just yeah.
Well, it's very educational to hear Suyapa speak about this, especially if, as just a fellow Honduran. Yeah, there's a lot of my just my existence, that my upbringing that I'm trying to undo. A lot of ingrained silence, just growing up in communities with undocumented people, and those being personal friends or family, and just also just trying to fit in so hard. Even as a Honduran at a school with Mexicans, I found myself trying to speak Spanish with the Chicano edge, and just kind of just trying to fit in. But I feel like as I get older, I don't know, I feel so empowered by my individuality. And I feel like there's such a thirst in my community of other Hondurans that I meet and other Central Americans that I meet, that we're just such individuals, and we want to kind of undo not being able to talk about our histories and not being able to talk about who we are. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to hear your side, Suyapa.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because in listening to your music, and from the earliest stuff to the current stuff, there does seem to me this moment right around the 2013, I think, with Systems, where Spanish starts showing up on the records. Was music for you an important language to discover this kind of other narrative of yourself?
Yeah, I think I've talked about this in press before, but yeah, it was just kind of this desperation to connect to who I am. Querías más de lo que podría ser. Me alejo más y tú no lo puedes ver. And this was before Latin craze. Obviously we had the Shakira moment when we were younger, but even now with Kali Uchis and Bad Bunny and people wanting to sing in Spanglish, and I made that EP because I just wanted my mom to kind of understand what I was doing, because she was so confused. And the first time I told her I wanted to be a musician, she cried. She was like, I wanted you to be a news anchor. Because she wanted me to be a news anchor because she would clean houses for this news anchor who had a gorgeous house in Pasadena. And she learned a lot of English from listening to the news. And she just, I don't know, to her that was the greatest achievement you could have. And she's over it now, but now she loves it. But yeah, I wanted to make this EP because she was so confused. And I didn't know what I was doing, because there wasn't really a lane carved for me. And now there are so many artists that just such individuals that I kind of would call peers. But yeah, and she gets it. And I love making music in Spanish. So it's definitely a part of my identity as well.
You recorded agua agua, water water in Spanish for your mom, so your mom could hear it. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
She's so confused. Because it's not like it's not music that she grew up with, you know, and she grew up with Celia Cruz and Fania All Stars and disco, and so she just, you know, and my dad was in Banda Blanca, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. She just didn't get like the fact that I was a producer, the fact that I was, you know, not making like a genre-specific music.
Dude, I just want to say we are like, what, 20 feet from a news desk, so we could make your dream come true.
Oh God,
yeah,
It's right there. You know, Josh, I know that we talked about this a little bit as we prepped for this. The space that exists in LA in the music scene for Central American musicians. Can you talk about? We can all talk about that space, actually. You know, what kind of space is there, pretty much?
I mean, to be honest, I'd be curious to hear everybody else's responses from, as a kind of outsider, or somebody who studies and thinks about music in Los Angeles. My sense has always been that I've always felt bad. I've always felt bad because I feel like Central Americans, in terms of music from Central America in Los Angeles, is always buried within various other music communities and music cultures, and especially with Spanish language music, within the, you know, hugely dominant, hugely powerful, with good reason, Mexican music scene. And so many Central American friends of mine will kind of almost default identify with ranchera or banda almost as Central American music in some way. And, you know, even in preparing for this, like, the amount that's out there on the history of Central American music in Los Angeles, there's not that much. It's interesting because I think, to your point about generations, right, there's a contemporary generation of Central Americans in Los Angeles who are actively trying to tell this story. So there's, you know, collectives that are DJ collectives who are digging back to, you know, Salvadoran and Guatemalan and, you know, Honduran records from the 60s and 70s and trying to revive those records and create a new language. It's not to say there wasn't a scene, right? There's a scene that exists in Latin American nightclubs in Los Angeles. There's a scene that exists at churches. There's a scene that exists in restaurants, and I can't stress restaurants enough. The role of restaurant bands and marimbas inside restaurants. In a way, it's parallel to the silences that we've been talking about. There's a kind of buried music culture that's absolutely there. It just isn't made visible or audible in kind of mainstream industry context.
I agree that it is there. My grandmother was part of that scene. That sort of like a underground, like Cuban music scene in LA. Tiny, there aren't that many, but she had a band called René Su Combo del Trópico. And she recorded, and they used to play all over the place. They used to play, you know, Luminarias. They played Pan American Club, which is like Temple Beaudry. And I remember going to all her shows, and it was great. My grandpa was the roadie.
And one group that I think we often don't think about is the Garifuna community, which is quite large in South LA
Right.
and New York.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You know, Aurelio Martinez is really famous, you know, in Honduras and Central America here. And but, you know, there is the Garifuna festival in November and in April, which marks when they came from St. Vincent to Honduras, and then when they moved to Belize in the 1797, right after the Haitian Revolution. And so, and it's almost like it's spiritual, but it's also a form of entertainment and, you know, form of remembrance. So there's drumming classes actually in parts of South LA. I don't know if you've heard of this, but so I went and took a Garifuna class, and then there was drumming after. It was really amazing. So there is pockets, right? The other thing I want to say is I grew up in Chicano LA, just like you. I wanted to be cool, you know, so I called enchiladas for us or tostadas for Mexico. So I was like, all right, they're tostadas, you know? But like at home, they're enchiladas. That's what we call enchiladas, the tostadas. So we had all kinds of battles with Chicanos about food and, you know, what we eat. But I grew up in Chicano LA. I mean, you know, Quetzal, Aslan Underground, those were like, you know, that building on Beaudry that they demolished. I mean, that's where we partied, you know, with Osomatli, which wasn't as famous back then, you know, in the 90s. I'm really telling you my age, but, you know.
I'm nodding. I'm like, yeah, world,
It's a
yeah.
safe space.
It's a safe
on
space.
this.
So, you know, and, but there was always one Central American. Like, I remember Culture Clash. There's two Central Americans, two Salvadorans in Culture Clash. We knew that. You know, a theater, I can't remember that, Las Ramonas, is that what they're called now? And they had a Nicaraguan performer, and there was always a Salvadoran and Nicaraguan. I was always like the one Honduran among Chicanos, and everybody knew I was Honduran because I was very proud of being Honduran, but I also wanted to be cool, right? So, we worked closely with the band Quetzal and Aslan Underground and Quinto Sol to put together the Encuentro Chicano Zapatista in Oventic, Chiapas in the 90s, 1997. And we brought this whole crew of artists, graffiti artists, performers. I had like no talent. I was just there to help organize. Everybody was so talented, People could do everything, like paint, sing, dance. Marta and Quetzal wrote songs with the Zapatistas, and I did nothing. But I mean, I helped organize the event with Laura Palomares, but like the 90s was a really interesting period because Central Americans were there. We were just not perhaps singing or doing all that stuff,
Yeah, and that's true to right now too. I mean, there's still the kind of like the secret Central Americans in Chicano artistic communities. I mean, I was even thinking of, La Santa Cecilia, for example, who are talked about with good reason as a Chicano group or a Mexican American group, and yet there are Central Americans in the group. And so I've always been curious about like what happens to those stories. Is there just like a collective agreement to fold identities into a larger identity? And if so, then what happens to the individual stories of the one Honduran in the group or the one Nicaraguan or the one Cuban in the group or whatever? That I think it's an interesting topic for Latino Los Angeles.
Okay, so we're still talking about music here. I know that Laura Lee, you were going to perform a song for us, and I was going to ask you, so like this photo, did it kind of like bring up a song for you? Was there something that just made you think of? And then you were performing a song by Banda Blanca. I did not realize there was a personal connection. Can you tell me a little bit about your dad and Banda Blanca and sort of being a part of all that?
Yeah, I looked at this photo and I thought of all the mom-related songs I could sing that were obvious, and there are a lot of beautiful ones. But I was thinking more of like music I heard as a kid and what I would hear in my house, what my mom would play. And, I am a musician because my dad is a musician. He was in a band called Banda Blanca from Honduras. They have a song called Sopa de Caracol, which is played at every quinceañera.
Guatawinegui con su, Guatawinegui guanaga, Guatawinegui con su, Guatawinegui guanaga. Si tú quieres bailar, sopa de caracol.
And not a lot of people know that about me, if they know that band. So I decided to play this song because it doesn't sound anything like the music that people know. And I don't know, I thought it was like really charming and cute.
We would love to hear it.
Yeah, of course, I would love to play it. Cuando yo pienso en ti y recuerdo nuestro amor, quisiera estar otra vez como ayer junto a ti. Ilusionado quiero estar, enamorado junto a ti. Ilusionado quiero estar, enamorado. Mi vida sin tu amor no parece ser igual. Me sentiría feliz si yo estoy junto a ti. Ilusionado quiero estar, enamorado junto a ti. Ilusionado quiero estar, enamorado. No sé si volverás otra vez a mí. No puedo vivir más si no estás aquí. Mi corazón llora por ti. Mi vida sin tu amor no parece ser igual. Me sentiría feliz si yo estoy junto a ti. Ilusionado quiero estar, enamorado junto a ti. Ilusionado quiero estar, enamorado junto a ti. Thank you.
That is beautiful. That's a beautiful song. For people who don't know the song, tell us just a tiny bit about what the song, what it means, and what it means to you.
That's the first time I played it. You know, you see these relationships with like other artists where they, you know, pay tribute to their parents who are musicians. I never had that moment, and then when I was like trying to learn this song, I was like, this is so cool and surreal that I get to play my dad's music, and I also think it's cool, because I think a lot of the other stuff is cool, but not my favorite. But I love this song. I love the lyrics because they're very sweet, and it's kind of doo-wop, but if you listen to the original, it's like, I don't know, it reminds me of like a doo-wop kind of song, or like even them trying to pay tribute to Beatles or do their interpretation of it. But it's just about, it's a love song, wanting to be close to someone.
So, Josh, you want
I was just going to say, I mean, I didn't know that your dad was in that band. And this, for listeners, right, this is not just like, oh, some band. I mean, this was deeply, deeply important band.
Yeah. I like to talk to my dad about music. I remember him texting this song to me and being like, I wrote all the arrangements and, you know, played keyboard and guitar, and I didn't use autotune. and I was like, are you trying to say something to me? Like, I was so like proud of him as a musician that I took a screenshot and I posted it on Instagram, and then Chromeo like messaged me and they were like, that's your dad? And I was like, yes. And they were like, I have the vinyl. And I'm like, okay, cool. Like, I don't know, it's just like a surreal moment where, I don't know, it kind of makes you proud. You know, my dad told me to learn piano when I was like 5, and I hated him for it. And now I'm very grateful, obviously.
So you're the daughter of 2 highly creative parents. So let's talk about your mom, because your mom is your you're co-designers, but kind of fashion designers together. I mean, we've seen some beautiful, beautiful stuff she's made that you've worn. Love to hear more.
Yeah, of course. You know, what's really interesting about my mom is I kind of wanted her to be involved in my costumes because she's like never had a creative outlet. She worked so hard. She was a nanny and a house cleaner until, you know, 3 years ago. So she's just, you know, that's been her whole life. And I remember her like kind of writing poetry in like a notebook when I was a kid, but nothing really like, I never felt her explore her creativity. And so with making my costumes for stage, obviously she was a seamstress, and like all the women in my family are seamstresses. It's just something that they learned as like a trade, you know, so they can get work. I felt like I was giving her something to share with me to be able to like work on my costumes.
What's your favorite?
I did this festival called Yola Dia in Los Angeles. We get all our fabric from downtown in the fashion district, and she saw this fabric that was like see-through and had flowers on it, and there was only like 2 or 3 yards of it left, and she picked it and she was like, I'm gonna make a dress out of this. And obviously I tell her what to do with the dress. I'm like, and we fight a lot. She wants things very shiny and tight.
So, but you're these creative partners, and it's this really kind of wonderful, unique relationship that you have as an artist with your mom. So, you know, in that sense, talking about mothers and daughters and about your mom, just how has your mom's creativity, you know, even though you say you didn't like, you know, beyond the poetry in the notebook, you didn't really see it early on, but like, you know, how are you kind of shaping each other now as creative people?
Yeah, I you know, to Yapa's comment earlier, I grew up like kind of just avoiding our feelings and reality, you know, not in such a like brutal way, obviously, but you know, and also, you know, mental health wasn't like a huge open thing as it is today, embraced in like, you know, normal life. It's definitely something that has happened in the last like 5 years with my musical project, being able to kind of be inspired by her and her journey as a woman, which is something I really explored in my last album, because she has experienced so much, so much heartache and so much love. And
I can't be living here when I'm hurt. Love is sleeping. I wanna do well.
There's still so much that I ask her. We went to, lunch a couple months ago, and I was like, when's the first time you fell in love? I asked her that for the first time, because we never really had conversations like that when I was growing up. It was just kind of like, survival, and I just like, I love being able to connect with her in that type of way. And it's, it's not always like easy, but it's just like new territory, and it is very inspiring for me as an artist.
Does she ever tour with you? Tell me about the whole, how does she come along as sort of like your designer? How do you work together?
She does not tour with me. She doesn't like flying, but we kind of just, we think about costumes, and we think about how practical they are and how impractical they are. I did a tour of Texas. And I wore latex during the summer, and we thought about that, but we just wanted to do it anyway. We were just like, you're gonna look hot on stage, It's just, kind of going for things. But she doesn't travel with me, but I definitely, I discuss shows with her and what we want to do.
So I guess it's kind of a question for everybody. So women and girls, mothers and daughters, we play this unique role in the immigrant ecosystem. Immigrant moms, man, right? Right. I don't have to say more. Role models for this intense work ethic, backbones, so many words that I can say, So I just kind of was hoping to kind of hear from you both as to the way that thinking about that mom, I'm going to go back to them again at the end, but thinking about that mom and that little girl, even if they were mother and daughter, how did the whole, like the immigrant mother and daughter dynamic shape you as people in your work, in your thoughts, in your art?
Yeah, my mom is hardcore. She doesn't cry. And if she sees me, when I was a kid, so she was hardcore. I think she softened up with the grandkids, but, she had to be, right? First of all, there's an incredible violence against women in Honduras that we often talk about as femicides now, but historically, right? Suffrage happened in 1957. And since then, there have been no public policies for gender and women's rights until the 90s, till the feminist movement was born. Honduras is a hard place. There's a lot of sexual violence against young women. Most women in my family were affected, right, by intrafamilial violence, alcoholism, all these things nobody wants to talk about, right? So my mom is, she was a tough one. And so I feel like growing up, I couldn't, if I was crying, it was like an interrogation. Why are you crying? What's wrong with you? What happened? Who did this to you? You can't just trust people. She was that kind of mom, right? Sort of. I was always by her side, and I was just saying, when she was a union member, she was a chief shop steward at Local 11 HRE, she took me to the union because she didn't trust a babysitter. She trusted one babysitter. I had one. Other than that, I was with her at all times. Protest, union meetings. I mean, it was incredible. This is before tablets. I had to just sit there and be good, you know what I mean? And, sometimes I'd bring a book, but other than that, it's like sit there for hours at these union negotiations or meetings and stuff. So I think it definitely shaped me because she introduced me to social movements quite early, and she talked about taking care of myself and going to school. That was really important for her, like having a career, because she never got to go to school. My mom went up to 6th grade, but she lived in a small town where, she was the kid that went to 6th grade. Everybody else went to 3rd grade, so she got to teach 3rd grade, and so she really valued education and, helped me with homework as much as she could. And, I couldn't miss school. I couldn't get in trouble, And even when I was a union organizer, she kept saying, you got to keep going to grad school, because she had worked at USC and she had met all these grad students She's like, there's more. You got to keep going. She didn't know what it looked like or how I was going to do it, but she knew there was more out there. So definitely, I mean, never called in sick, rain or shine. She went to work. This is the kind of modeling I had, Like, I feel guilty when I call in sick, because my mom never did, and I was pretty proud of my perfect attendance, going to school, because there was no option. You had to go, right? Even if you had a cold. I don't know what she would have done with COVID, but, my mom was like pretty hardcore.
Yeah, no, that's it resonates. It resonates. We want to kind of go back to that little girl and her mom. There's silence, but there's purpose. There's something happening there. We don't know where they're going to, where they're coming from. We don't know how long they've lived here. We don't know, but maybe they're going to that little store. They're going to get their first clothes, with their first paycheck. I guess I'm going to ask you all to use your imaginations. How do you picture the woman and the little girl in the photo today? Who are they today? Who did they become? What are they doing right now?
I'd like to think that they're us, right? A singer, songwriter, producer, and a professor. The daughter is, a journalist. I like to say that because although we'd have to really study how many Central American children who came in the 80s have made it to grad school, we know that there's more secondary education achievement for our generation than for our parents' generation, right? Our parents dreamed of this education that they couldn't get. And I'm hoping the woman is retired and healthy and living her best life and has a fancy car, Like, no, I don't want to create a middle class sort of scenario here, right? Because, my mother actually worked really hard, had a union job. We had health care, thank goodness, right, for that. But was not able to purchase a home, was not able to ascend to the middle class. It really was her children who helped her ascend or to have needed resources. But she's still so proud of all her work and achievements and those contracts that they fought for, right? I think about Loreli's story of her mom wanting to help others. And, that's our mothers all the time, right? People still call her, like union members from USC. She's been retired since the 90s. They still call her to ask her about the union contract, or if they have some issue, how would they resolve it, So I think our mothers are those women, My mom wasn't a great cook. Like, she didn't make tamales or pupusas. This is why we went to Pico Union to buy them. But she makes great soups, I have to say. That's her forte. But she has this network of women that we can call on for special occasions, like tamales, and recently she got into fried cheese, like the Nicaraguan fried cheese. I don't know if you've tried it. It's amazing. So this lady that goes to Nicaragua brings it back to LA and then sells her, and I'm like, how did you find this? She's like, this lady, she goes to Nicaragua, she brings back the cheese. So I'd like to think that that's who they are, right? That they may be working class women who are still living in a community and thriving, and hopefully that child, addressed the trauma and is successful.
I look at my peers and I look at where they're at with their family, because I know that if they saw this photo, they would relate to it in a lot of ways. And the people that I know and the people that I've met that aren't in my field, Hondurans in crypto, in tech, and whose parents are painters, like they paint houses. And they are, contractors and construction workers. And I mean, the leap is just crazy. And that's kind of, I think, when I see, a mother and a daughter, or whoever they are, that the kind of like urgency and opportunity, with her stride down the street. So yeah, I don't know. I have so many friends where I'm constantly like surprised and amazed by what my peers are doing, whether they're fashion designers or whether they're, working at art galleries or giving back to their community and organizing. And so I think it's endless potential.
I see in that photo, I see purpose. I see a sense of purpose. I see a sense of, okay, aquí estamos, tenemos que resolver. Right? We have to get this done. We have to like take care of something right now. And that is, what I see kind of them carrying them through and carrying them through the years. They have kept on resolviendo. Yes, and hopefully mom is now in a good place. I know they're still close. I know that daughter drives her to Kaiser. That's kind of my life right now, But yeah, so it's that's where I see them now. They're still close. Before I break down.
No, you can. It's okay.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I just want Laura Lee to know that we actually tried to get your mom here today, but her rates, I don't know if you know, her rates are so high.
Did you actually?
And her writer is crazy.
Did you actually?
No, I didn't.
Oh.
I should have. In hindsight,
I am
kicking
my
myself.
mother's daughter.
Yeah. I mean, when I saw the photograph, to be frank, knowing Laura Lee's music and knowing a bit about your story, and I had actually recently seen the short, the video piece that you did for
Uproxx.
Yeah, with your mother, talking about upcycling and actually working together to make clothing. When I saw that photograph, I just immediately thought, I would love to know what you thought of it. And I thought of you and your mother. I mean, your mother's become such a central part of your public profile in a lot of ways.
Yes.
That to me, that photograph was a pretty incredible connection to you.
I mean, I love that is a part of my identity as an artist, because I just know that other people are going to see that and either, feel seen by my connection or feel the need to like reconnect with their parents or embrace like parts of them that they feel like societally they have repressed. But yeah, I feel very thankful for Siapa being here today because of the like historical context you've provided to everything. Because I can sit here and just be like, we never talked about anything. Or, like my mom, she's very protective, but you give like context about like the femicides in Central America and, the political upheaval in Honduras and why people migrated. And so, I don't know, I just feel really grateful. I need to take a class from you.
Yes, we need to hang out. I brought you a copy of my book.
Oh,
Yes,
and
I
she wrote a
dedicate my book
book?
to young Hondurans, and I think you should definitely have a copy.
I would love to.
Just looking at your history, because I do think that you are part of a new generation of wanting to reconnect with the past. And it gives me hope because there's the earlier generation that wants to kind of move on and not talk about the past, and our mothers are not part of the past. They're these creators and generators, of the future. And so I think it's really awesome. I was just looking through all your videos and thinking, oh my God, she's so talented.
Yeah, it is interesting, like how a generation before us or two generations before us, my mom grew up and she's like, Rodriguez, we're Spanish. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know, Mom. Like, I know that the Spanish and the French colonized Honduras, but you don't really look Spanish, Like there's definitely part of it. And I'm always asking her about, our indigenous history and like family history, and I want to know so much about my grandma and like the family members that we never talk about. So, which is I feel like is just not part of like her makeup as like a person from that generation, coming from Honduras to America and wanting to just fit in to this new life.
That's what we're here, I guess, to do, what our generation can do. We're of different generations, but I guess as the second generation or the 1.5 generation, right, is that, we kind of, there's this continuum, right, to our families' histories, past and present. And, now we draw them out. Now we help them tell their stories. Now sometimes we tell their story just through our own voice in our own way and things that we create, but it drives us, like they are the driving force. I know that Laura Lee, you have a great song that you want to perform, and we really want to hear it.
It's a song I love very much. It's called Woman is a Word, and it is about breaking gender norms and kind of, just being able to be whatever the word woman is to you.
Let's hear it.
I'm only an image of what you see. I'm only an image of what you see. I'm only an image of what you see. You don't know me, you don't know me, you don't know me. I'm only an image of what you see. I'm only an image of what you see. I'm only an image of what you see. You don't know me, you don't know me, you don't know me. I'm only a woman if woman is a word. I'm only a woman if woman is a word. I'm only a woman if woman is a word. Bird to be, bird to be, bird to be. I'm always coming on the inside. I'm always coming on the inside. I'm always coming on the inside. When you're coming on the outside. I'm only a figure if you can see my frame. I'm only a figure if you can see my frame. I'm only a figure if you can see my frame. Fire with no fire with no fire with no flame. I'm only a struggle if I get in your way. I'm only a struggle if I get in your way. I'm only a struggle if I get in your way. You made the road one way. I'm only a woman if woman is a word. I'm only a woman if woman is a word. I'm only a woman if woman is a word. Bird to be, bird to be, bird to be. I'm always coming on the inside. I'm always coming on the inside. I'm always coming on the inside. When you're coming on the outside. Thank you.
Wow, that was beautiful. Woman is a word. Thank you all so much, and thanks to our audience for joining us for this Evoke LA event. It's a special series in collaboration between KPCC LAist, Aloud, and the Los Angeles Public Library. I want to say thanks again to series curator Josh Kuhn and today's guests, musician and composer Laura Lee Rodriguez, also known as Empress of, and Pitzer College Associate Professor Suyapa Portillo Villeda. And thank you again so much to Ani Boyajian and the Los Angeles Public Library.